Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Cunningham, and today we're going to be exploring how educated were the gospel writers. And before we even ask that question, we have to back up even more and ask the question, who wrote the gospels? Now you might think it's obvious. Oh, of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the gospels. Actually, it's not as simple as that. While tradition does say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the gospels, there is nothing in the text that says that those people wrote the Gospels. And in fact, when we talk about the Gospels being eyewitnesses, it's kind of misleading because the tradition, even the tradition that does assign particular people that wrote those Gospels, those aren't all eyewitnesses. You think of Mark. Mark was not one of the 12. You think of Luke. Luke is not one of the 12. So the whole idea about Gospels being eyewitnesses is kind of undermined at the very outset. Not only that, but we kind of question whether some of the attribution or names that are assigned to the Gospels are legit, and they might just be more tradition and wishful thinking. You might say, well, the Gospel of Matthew is the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of Mark. Well, you'd only start to name Gospels like that if you had to distinguish them. What would you name the first Gospel? Would you name the first Gospel the Gospel according to Matthew? Because the Gospel according to Matthew is trying to distinguish itself from another Gospel. But if it's the first Gospel, why would you want to distinguish yourself from another Gospel? So, like I said in previous videos, the first Gospel that was written was probably Mark. And we have a pretty good idea about what what its original title was. And that would be the very first line in Mark 1:1, the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, or the Christ. Messiah and Christ mean the same thing. Messiah is the Hebrew term and Christ is the Greek term. Matthew, we kind of have a similar situation too. Matthew's title is probably in its first line. Some translations will say the account of the genealogies of Jesus Christ. That's probably not all that helpful, because if you go back to the Greek, it really is, you'd read there, it is the book of Genesis of Jesus Christ. So that sounds more like a book title than the Gospel according to Matthew, as it would be later on. So we can't really with any firm confidence say, oh, the apostles wrote this. But what we can be confident in about saying concerning these writers is one thing. And that one thing is that they knew Greek. How do I know that they knew Greek? They wrote in Greek. And that is pretty much indisputable. If somebody were to dispute that, that would be awfully odd. If they knew Greek, they had a Greek education. And this, the idea of a Greek education is not just flippant. It holds to a very strict structure and pattern. And they even given this educational pattern in Greek a word, and it's called the encyclopaideia, or you might know it as, in English, encyclopedia. And that means that they would go through this cycle of education in their Greek training. And that is, they would start with Homer, they would learn how to read Homer, they would memorize Homer, they would play with Homer by changing things around. And they would do a lot of things with Homer and other classical works at the very outset. And this would be the grammatical stage of their education. After the grammatical stage of their education would become the philosophical training, but they're being trained in Greek literature all the while. And the last stage, of course, is rhetoric. To have this kind of education, this encyclopaideia, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire would be phenomenal. Now remember, the empire is split into the Latin West and the Greek East. It would be phenomenal because only about 10% of people probably were literate at the time. And that 10% estimation is at the best of times in Athens under the Athenian democracy. But then we need to define literacy, because we can't just leave it at that, because there's levels of literacy. So We know that gospel writers are well educated, probably the top 10%, but we need to push it further. Not only can they read, but obviously they can write too. They can not just write, they can compose letters. But what's even higher than composing a letter, or they can even be dictated to, they could transcribe. That's probably true. But beyond that, we know that they can compose letters as such. Not only can they probably compose letters, we know that they can compose complex narratives with plots that include sophisticated literary devices such as foreshadowing. These gospel writers are elites, intellectual elites in the empire. These are not just people that have all of a sudden, without any education, started to blindly follow Jesus, and then after all is said and done, they started writing things down. No, these people who wrote the Gospels were very well educated. And in fact, there's a high probability that some of the Gospel writers were multilingual. That is, Mark and Matthew probably knew Aramaic and Hebrew. So we're talking about, again, elites, intellectual elites in the Roman Empire. Now, some of you might say, well, I don't know much Greek, but I know it's the kind of Greek that they used was called Koine Greek, and it really wasn't all that sophisticated. So how can these really be the intellectual elites of their day? Well, that's just the language that they were born into. That was the lingua franca at the time. Yes, the Greek before was specifically Attic Greek came and was its predecessor. And then after Koine Greek came a different kind of Greek with what's called the Second Sophisticate. And to put things into perspective, that's like saying, because I don't use these and thous in my language, I'm not all that educated, and I'm not, I really don't know what I'm talking about, and I can't write good literature just because I don't use these and thous. Another thing that people might say is that, well, Jesus's followers, these apostles, these were just fishermen. They weren't all that educated. Well, again, that goes back to who wrote the Gospels. Did the apostles write the Gospels or not? We don't have any concrete evidence outside of much, much later tradition that has anything to do with the apostles. Even John, when he says, and I bear witness, he bears witness to the testimony, not the events, which are two different things. Lastly, people might say, well, it must not be that great of literature if it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible not because it's good literature, but because it teaches good morals. However, that kind of argumentation doesn't really treat the text fairly. It's almost like guilt by association. Because it's put in this box, it must be this kind of literature. The Bible and the New Testament and the whole Bible has a bunch of different literature of all kinds of range of quality of literature. The Gospels as literature should stand on their own merit. And like I said before, they do some pretty sophisticated things like foreshadowing and mimesis as well, which was a very technical and sophisticated way to call back to previous texts. All right, I hope that answers your question, that the Gospel writers were very well educated, and I'll see you in the next one.